A little bit of breaking news for you here. If you are born in the United States, you are an American. That is not breaking news. That is something that is written in our Constitution and has been true for the duration of our republic. That said, when Donald Trump was sworn in for his second term 30 days ago, he signed an executive order that proclaimed that to no longer be true. This, of course, was immediately challenged in court. And among the federal courts it was laughed out of was one in Washington State, a Seattle-based federal judge ruled that Trump's executive order could not go into effect. The judge passed an injunction against the executive order going into effect. The Justice Department, or the Trump administration then appealed that. They've appealed it to the Ninth Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals, which sits on the West Coast. And tonight, a three-judge panel of the Ninth Circuit has just declined the Justice Department's request to get rid of that judge's injunction to let Trump's executive order go into effect. The reason this is important is because this sets up potentially a rocket ship, very quick trip to the United States Supreme Court. When Trump passed this executive order, he knew, he had to know, that it was blatantly unconstitutional. The point of passing it anyway, of signing it anyway, was to get the Supreme Court to rule to effectively change the Constitution, to make it so that if you're born in this country, you are no longer a citizen. With this ruling tonight from a three-judge panel in the Ninth Circuit, this would appeal to be teed up for a challenge directly to the U.S. Supreme Court. One of the first matters that Trump has provoked a conflict with U.S. law and constitutional understanding about that is going to the Supreme Court. This ruling just in moments ago from the Ninth Circuit. We'll keep you posted as we learn more. Now it's time for the last word with the great Lawrence O'Donnell.
Rachel, so this was one of those nights when I'm walking through the hallways to get here, and the silent TV monitors that I'm walking by show you with some pretty important breaking news about birthright citizenship, and I can't hear a word of it. All I know is there's this thing at the bottom of the screen that says, this really important thing has happened. I've taken a quick look at the breaking news report on it, and it's a Trump-appointed judge is saying, no, this case can be handled through the standard procedures and it's not an emergency. We don't have to go into an emergency mode to deal with your attempt to hand rewrite the Constitution.
Yeah, and it's very well written. It's written in non-legalese. Yeah. Judges are charged to reach their decisions apart from ideology or political preference. When we decide issues of significant public importance and political controversy, hours after we finish reading the final brief, we should not be surprised if the public questions whether we are politicians in disguise. In recent times, nearly all judges and lawyers have attended seminar after seminar discussing ways to increase public trust in the legal system. Moving beyond wringing our hands and wishing things were different, one concrete thing we can do is to decline to decide or pre-decide cases on an emergency basis when there is no emergency warranting a deviation from our normal deliberate practice. Because they are going to appeal this on an emergency basis to the Supreme Court. And here's this appeals court judge in the Ninth Circuit being like, this is a lot of things. An emergency is not one of them. You're just trying to change the Constitution.
Yeah, and this is the same Supreme Court that was in absolutely no rush to hear Jack Smith's appeal to the Supreme Court about the whole issue of presidential immunity. They wanted to deal with that one as slowly as they possibly could.
Yeah. But this one is Trump trying to change the Constitution so you're no longer an American if you're born in America. Mm-hmm. The idea that this has to be taken up on some emergency basis. I mean, we'll see what the Supreme Court does as Justice Department tries to rocket this to the Supreme Court. But this pushback from this three-judge panel at the Ninth Circuit is pretty strong.
Yeah, Trump's on a losing streak with this one so far.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Thank you, Rachel.
The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau was founded back in 2011 in the wake of the financial crisis with the express purpose of protecting consumers. It was proposed and then established by a then little-known Harvard professor named Elizabeth Warren. She was prevented by Republicans from leading the agency, which led pretty directly to her becoming a U.S. senator and the Elizabeth Warren you know today. In the last 14 years, the CFPB has recovered over $20 billion from consumers. But now Doge champion Elon Musk tweeted, CFPB, RIP. I'm joined now by Senator Elizabeth Warren, ranking member of the Banking Committee, who's calling on the Trump administration to, quote, remove members of Elon Musk's Doge from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, end quote, citing the risk of Musk, quote, enriching himself at the expense of American taxpayers through Doge's illegal efforts to dismantle the CFPB, end quote. Senator Warren, good to see you. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
I don't know how many years it's been that you and I have been talking about CFPB. I think since before it started.
Yes.
I never understood then, and I don't understand now. If you want to target the government for waste, fraud, and inefficiency, why would you go after the place that actually has a record, $20 billion or more, being returned to consumers who would not have been able to get that money from predatory companies?
Well, you obviously wouldn't, because this is an agency that is the cop on the beat just to make sure people don't get cheated, and it has really delivered on that. Think about it this way, Allie, when we talk about those numbers, it has found more than $20 billion where these big banks have cheated people. And the agency didn't just say, shame on you, don't do it again. It said, you give that money back to the people you cheated and watched them and made them do it. Man, to me, that is government efficiency.
Now, there are a couple of things here. One is obviously you're invested in your work in the Senate and in your work through founding the CFPB in the CFPB. But there's a conflict of interest that you and Adam Schiff write about here with Elon Musk having anything to do with the structuring or restructuring of CFPB. Why?
So here's the story. Remember how Elon Musk bought Twitter, turned it into X, and hemorrhaged buckets of money? Well, he announced, hey, he had another plan to make more money, and that is he would create something called X money. And the idea was, in the same way that X now gets all of your social media information, you would give them all your financial information and make financial transactions on this site. Now, he can do that. He can launch a financial platform. But when he does, he's going to have a cop standing right over his shoulder, just making sure that he follows the law, that he doesn't cheat people, he doesn't trick people, and he doesn't suck up all of their personal information to use it however he wants or sell it wherever he wants. One cop on the beat would be looking over Elon Musk's shoulder, and you know where that cop is going to come from. It's from the CFPB. So this looks like a really plausible business plan. If you're a bank robber, how about, if you get the chance, fire the cops before you waltz into the lobby of the bank? And Elon Musk appears to have decided he will sideline the financial cops before he decides to launch his own personal platform. That is why Elon Musk should not be allowed anywhere near the CFPB. It is a clear conflict of interest. And Senator Schiff and I are after this right now. This is fundamentally wrong for him to be doing this.
Here's the problem with all of the dismantling. In fact, it's the same thing with what Donald Trump said about Ukraine today. When systems work in the background, like our international world order or our governmental systems like CFPB, people don't know that they work. They don't necessarily get it. So how do you advance from a letter from you and Adam Schiff into creating enough of a stir that people fight back and say, you can't take these things away that actually work? Everybody wants government to be more efficient. There's no question about that.
So, you put your finger on it, and that is, you got to create the stir. People have to remember why this agency works for them. That $21 billion went back into their pockets. Right now, more than 6.5 million people have filed complaints with the CFPB and gotten help from that agency. That CFPB is very popular among Democrats, Republicans, independents, because they recognize having a cop on the beat keeps the playing field level, and that's what they want to see. Last week, we had Jerome Powell, the head of the Fed, in for testimony before the Banking Committee, and I just asked him flat out. I said, with the CFPB sidelined, who is out there? Who's the one watching to make sure you don't get cheated on any of your financial products? And his answer was, nobody. There's nobody there. So that means, for anybody who's listening to this, if you have a credit card, a checking account, a savings account, you have a mortgage, you have a car loan, you have a student loan, you use Venmo or any of the other online platforms, just understand, maybe you won't get cheated. But the cops have all been told, leave the field. That's what Elon Musk has done. And I think that's pretty alarming. And all of us need to push back on this. We want our financial cops back on the beat.
Today, President Donald Trump is attacking Ukrainian President Zelensky on social media, falsely calling him a dictator without elections, saying that Zelensky has done a terrible job and claiming that Ukraine is shattered. Now, this comes after Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said Ukraine is not for sale and that Donald Trump is in a disinformation bubble. His comments followed President Trump's comments that when he erroneously blamed Ukraine for starting the war with Russia in that Fox interviews last night. Have a listen.
And I think I have the power to end this war. And I think it's going very well. But today I heard, oh, well, we weren't invited. Well, you've been there for 3 years. You should have ended it 3 years. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal. I could have made a deal for Ukraine that would have given them almost all of the land, everything, almost all of the land, and no people would have been killed, and no city would have been demolished, and not one dome would have been knocked down. But they chose not to do it that way.
All right, joining us now is New York Times chief White House reporter Peter Baker. Hi, Peter. And Michael Allen is here with us in studio, former special assistant to President George W. Bush. He's now the managing director for Beacon Global Strategies. Peter, I want to start with you. First of all, I was an election monitor in Ukraine during Zelensky's election. I can promise you he was, in fact, elected. And as far as we knew at the time, there were no irregularities or anything else. But I also want to ask you, President Trump is making these kind of head-spinning allegations against Ukrainian President Zelensky after Zelensky said he's in a disinformation bubble. What is Trump's goal here? Is he just trying to lean into or kind of double down on what he's said? Where do you go with this?
Well, I'm glad to hear that you were there and that you could tell us about that election. That's important. It's remarkable, of course, to hear an American president talk about an ally the way he's talking about Volodymyr Zelensky, whereas he says nothing about Vladimir Putin, who actually is a dictator, who actually does have manipulated elections that are not democratic, who actually is the one who launched the invasion. Full-scale invasion 30 years ago. Trump said yesterday, you started it, meaning the Ukrainians. Of course they did not start it. He said today that Zelensky tricked the United States into giving him $350 billion to go to war. Obviously not true. And what's remarkable about it, of course, is we've never seen anything like this from an American president. And what is his goal? He has had a thing about Ukraine going back years. He was convinced that Ukraine interfered in the 2016 election against him. That's a Russian talking point, but it's one that he has accepted. And he has been, therefore, had antipathy toward Ukraine ever since. It was part of his first impeachment back in 2018 and 19, or sorry, 2019 and 20. And I think that that's just his head has always been in a negative space towards Ukraine and in a positive space towards Putin.
The other thing that's kind of remarkable about this is he's not only going against established fact, he's going against U.S. intelligence. Because if you remember, it was U.S. intelligence that was warning at the Munich Security Conference 3 years ago, Russia is going to invade, Russia is planning to invade. And it was the Europeans and the Ukrainians who kind of didn't believe it until all of a sudden it happened. So we also have NBC News is reporting that U.S. intelligence U.S. intelligence shows Putin isn't really interested in a peace deal right now, and he still wants to control all of Ukraine. So you've got Putin coming out today and saying he's ready to return to the negotiating table, and he'd be happy to meet President Trump. But how can anyone trust him? I know the Ukrainians don't. Should the Americans?
Well, I think the Ukrainians ought to take a deep breath here. This is Trump, the real estate developer, jawboning a party to an eventual transaction. It's not a style we're used to, but it is Trump's way. Keith Kellogg is in Ukraine. If I were Zelensky, I would send a message back to President Trump through him about the types of things that he might be able to agree to in an eventual negotiation. On Putin's recalcitrance, it's going to happen. It will appear and rear its head at some point in these negotiations, and the worm will turn, and Trump will begin to criticize Putin more harshly to condition him to come to the table. But But in the
you don't think this altruistic diplomatic Putin is going to last through the second or third phase of these negotiations?
I don't think so, because I can't imagine any scenario where we really arrest the root causes of what caused this war. I don't believe, even if Trump is not in a great place on Zelensky, that he wants to totally sell Ukraine out. And that's ultimately what Putin wants, a Ukraine that doesn't exist.
Peter, I also want to get your take on this meeting between Secretary Rubio and Lavrov yesterday in Saudi Arabia. First of all, where has Lavrov been? I feel like he was out of favor for a while, and now all of a sudden he's back center stage in this very high-profile negotiation. But they came out of that room without having any European or Ukrainian input. And can there be an end to the war without one of the parties involved in the war in the room? Is it even remotely possible?
Well, what you hear, of course, is a disconnect, right? Rubio says, look, of course, we're going to consult with the Europeans. Of course, we're going to consult with the Ukrainians. In fact, he called a number of European foreign ministers shortly after his meeting with Lavrov in Saudi Arabia. But you're right. It was a big deal that the Ukrainians felt so left out. President Zelensky was planning to go to Saudi Arabia and then told basically that he wasn't welcome and didn't end up making the trip. Meanwhile, even as Rubio is trying to reassure people, yes, of course, we're going to do this in concert with our allies, you hear Trump say yesterday, no, they don't deserve a seat at the table, meaning the Ukrainians, because they started the war and they didn't make a deal over the last 3 years. What deal should they have made over the last 3 years? A deal that would surrender their territory. And that's what he wants them to do. So he's putting a lot of pressure on Zelensky. He's making clear that whatever deal he makes with Putin is what he thinks it should be, not necessarily what Zelensky thinks it will be. And it's left the Europeans on the sideline trying to figure out what their play is.
Yeah, Peter, I also want to ask you about your article today in the Times. You write, Mr. Trump is in the middle of executing one of the most jaw-dropping pivots in American foreign policy in generations, a 180-degree turn that will force friends and foes to recalibrate in fundamental ways. You know, I just came back from Munich, where this was completely on display, to the point where I was told in one meeting, leaders just kind of went on with their planned speeches about American-European friendship because they didn't really know what else to do. What message is the U.S. sending to our allies right now?
Well, I think the message is that we're in the middle of what we've been calling a new Cold War, and it looks like America may be switching sides. I mean, Trump obviously says and favors the points that the Kremlin has put out there. The concessions that he has floated for any peace talks have been exactly what the Kremlin wants, which is to say sanctions are lifted. He gets to keep all the territory he illegally seized by force. Ukraine doesn't get any security guarantees, much less NATO membership from the United States. Trump is even floating the idea of readmitting Russia into the G7, which, of course, the rest of the G7 would not want to do. Meanwhile, the Europeans, what they're hearing from Washington is, you're a bunch of bad partners. You're free riders. You're not spending enough on your military. We don't think you're fair to us on trade. We're going to slap tariffs on you. We think you're too mean to the neo-Nazi party in Germany. That's the message.
Sorry, Peter, I think we lost you there for a sec. Can you hear us?
Yeah,
sorry, you were saying, you said that's the message that you think Trump is sending right now?
Yeah, the message that Trump is sending to the European allies is he doesn't think much of you. He doesn't particularly care about being in NATO. In fact, he covets the territory of some of our NATO partners, including Canada, which he says he wants to make the 51st state in Greenland, which is affiliated with Denmark. So right now it's a period of great tension and a big rift growing potentially with the European allies. At the same time, Trump is siding up to Putin's view of Ukraine.
Yeah, I actually asked the Canadian Foreign Minister Melanie Joly about red, white, and blue land in Greenland, and she pushed back very astutely and said, "This is not a joke." Yeah. And I said, "No, it's not." I want to ask you, Michael, talking to leaders in Europe, they still have a consensus on Ukraine. Yeah. They still have a consensus on supporting Ukraine. Where there's fear is that they do not have a consensus with how to deal with what Peter was just talking about, how to negotiate, how to navigate this new confrontational America. And there's a concern that as allies take a different tactic, some may choose to be obsequious, some may choose to be confrontational, some may try to stay neutral. That approach in itself could fracture the European alliance. Not so much the issue of Ukraine, but they could be less effective if they're all fighting over how to deal with Trump. What's your take on that?
Well, they need unity here. Yeah. And I think that's what Trump smells in them. They got together Monday, the day after the Munich Security Conference, and didn't really have anything to come out and say. If I'm Europe, And I'm faced with the news of this tweet today and digesting everything happened in the weekend. They need to put something on the table. They need to come out and say, we'll have 50,000 European troops as part of a peacekeeping force eventually, as long as we have some American involvement in the end. Or here's a brand new plan to fund Ukraine. Or here's one of the weapon systems that we're going to develop a comparative advantage in and fund this for Ukraine into the future. Right now, they're just kind of running around. No one knows where they are. They want a seat at the table, but I think you can't beat something with nothing. They need something to bring to Trump, and that might impress Trump, and Trump might bring him in then.
I want to show you, we have some new images coming in. This is Keith Kellogg being greeted by the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine in Kyiv. You know, we were just talking about what message President Zelensky should send through Kellogg. What message should Europe send? Could this possibly have a backlash? Because if you remember, Putin's approach to this was to try to fracture NATO. It actually made NATO stronger, and it gained it 2 new members, Finland and Sweden. Could Trump's criticism of Europe have the same effect? Could we see the EU do those exact things you were just talking about because they feel like they really have to?
I think privately, a lot of people in the White House are glad of the messages that they sent this weekend because it does catalyze the Europeans to a degree. They need to come up with something tangible, as I said, but I think they're on notice that things have fundamentally changed with Trump in office. They need to start putting things on the table, and that's the way they respond to Trump. That's the way they buy themselves a seat into these international negotiations. I don't think it's enough to just say, I used to be a world power, I ought to be at the table. I think they got to come in with something.
Put up.
That's right.
All right, Peter Baker and Michael Allen, thank you both so much.
Thank you.
But the closest you're going to get to stopping it at the source, to stopping, for example, the destruction of the American legal system, to stopping the destruction of our health system and the basic services that keep people alive and that keep the country functioning, the hardest leverage that can be applied against him at the source is what hypothetically would come from Republicans. And I know, cynically, you may never expect to get that. But strategically, you cannot stop trying to get it because of its crucial importance. And I'm just going to give you one example here, just one case study. Louisiana Senator Bill Cassidy. I always think of him as having kind of an unforgettable name, but a very memorable haircut. He always looked to me like an otherwise healthy person who has just been gently electrocuted. But Senator Bill Cassidy is a senator. He's also a physician. He's a gastroenterologist. He got into the Senate in a campaign in 2014 that largely focused on his role as a doctor. He was best known, including in that campaign, not just for being a good doctor for his individual patients, but for having championed in his home state of Louisiana, having championed a new free vaccination program for Louisiana school kids, specifically hepatitis B vaccination. And he frequently told this important, heartbreaking story about what he called his worst day as a doctor. Senator Bill Cassidy, as a doctor, had an 18-year-old patient who had contracted hepatitis B. And as an 18-year-old, her health crashed. He had to scramble to have her airlifted to Shreveport, Louisiana, to get an emergency liver transplant. He said in one interview with the Washington Post, quote, "I was sitting there thinking, if we had vaccinated this girl with a $50 vaccine, we could have saved a $250,000 operation and a lifetime of $50,000 a year medical bills." And that was just one interview that he did about this case. But he's given a ton of interviews about this case. He talks about it all the time. He talked about it for years. He still talks about it. He relayed that story again in his opening statement in the confirmation hearings that he oversaw for Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to be Secretary of Health and Human Services. But that program and that revelation about the importance of that kind of public health effort, it's arguably the whole reason he is a senator at all. Hep B vaccination for kids is his origin story as a public servant. It is the one thing he most wants to be known for, and probably the thing he most is known for, at least so far. Because now he's the chair of the Health Committee in the second Trump term. And as the senator who chairs the Health Committee, he did just oversee the confirmation of Bobby Kennedy Jr. to be the nation's health secretary. And here's him on Hep B vaccination and what a stupid idea it is.
The vaccine schedule immediately after they passed the Vaccine Act exploded because all these companies were rushing to get new vaccines onto the schedule. Many of them for diseases that weren't even casually contagious, like ridiculous diseases that are in that, like hepatitis B. Why would you you get hepatitis B from, from sharing needles or from like going to a really seasoned prostitute or from sort of compulsive homosexual behavior.
Compulsive homosexual behavior or going to a really well-seasoned prostitute. That's the only way you get hepatitis B. He intones on Joe Rogan's podcast, which is not at all true. And that's okay. You can believe stuff that's not true. You can say anything you want on a podcast and knock yourself out. But in a working political system, you probably don't then get confirmed as health secretary in the United States government. If the chairman of the health committee in the Senate that has to confirm you actually does know what he's talking about on this issue because he's a gastroenterologist who's devoted his life as a public servant to the cause of Hep B vaccination, saving young people's lives. Senator Bill Cassidy, nevertheless, ate up that pile and cast his vote for Bobby Kennedy to be health secretary in the United States. He said that he'd had conversations with Kennedy that assured him that Kennedy wasn't essentially as crazy on this issue of vaccines as he seemed. He also, though, in the confirmation process, got an explicit assurance from Kennedy that if he were confirmed as health secretary, he wouldn't try to change the vaccine schedule for American kids. Well, now Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has been sworn in as health secretary, and in his first full day on the job, wouldn't you know it, he confirmed that he definitely is going to look into that vaccine schedule, saying, quote, nothing's going to be off limits. Republican Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana hasn't been brave yet. He does not feel inspired by calls to man the barricades to stand up for democracy. Honestly, he just does not appear to be inspired along these lines, like some other Americans may be. But he does chair the Health Committee in the United States Senate. And he did just vote to confirm someone who says that his physician's knowledge about vaccines is ridiculous. Because, what, Kennedy's sure that Bill Cassidy's 18-year-old patient must have gotten the hepatitis B from compulsive homosexual behavior or contact with a really well-seasoned prostitute? Senator Bill Cassidy really did just vote to confirm someone who appears to have lied right to his face under oath in the confirmation process on saying he wouldn't revisit the kids' vaccine schedule, something that Bill Cassidy has effectively worked on his whole life. So will Bill Cassidy get brave on this? Can't afford to give up on that prospect as a country. After Senator Cassidy oversaw the confirmation of Bobby Kennedy for that job of health secretary, just to add insult and further injury to injury, Senator Bill Cassidy's own home state of Louisiana announced that they will no longer promote vaccines for Louisiana school kids. On the strength, presumably, of the endorsement for vaccine quackery that the confirmation of Bobby Kennedy implied, they will no longer promote vaccines for kids in Louisiana. Senator Bill Cassidy, that is your home state. Look what you have wrought. Look what you are doing to your own life's work. And I say that, Senator Cassidy, because you have a ton of power here. You are the chairman of the Health Committee in the Senate. You can call Robert F. Kennedy Jr. into the Senate and hold hearings and demand information and demand testimony. And in so doing, you have more power than anybody in this country to turn this thing around. And it is something on which you are an expert and on which you are emotionally committed and to which you have devoted your life. You think he'll do it?
Good evening once again. I'm Stephanie Ruhle, and welcome to the Midweek Nightcap. It is day 31 of the second Trump administration. I know you feel like you've aged 6 years, but it's only been 31 days. And on this day, DOGE has hit the Defense Department. NBC News reports its employees arrived at the Pentagon earlier this week, but the agency has not shared their names or what exactly they're doing there. And Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth is considering firing generals as early as next week. Meanwhile, tension between the U.S. and Ukraine is escalating after President Trump called Ukrainian President Zelensky a dictator. That comment, as well as his earlier suggestion that Ukraine should not have started the war, has spurred a handful of Senate Republicans to distance themselves from the leader of their party. Vice President J.D. Vance, on the other hand, you know what he did, double down. In an interview with a conservative outlet earlier today, he said Zelensky's public response to President Trump's criticism was, quote, disgraceful. The Ukrainian president had said that Trump had been caught in a web of disinformation from Russia over the war in Ukraine. We got a lot to cover, so let's get smarter with the help of our nightcap tonight. Abby Livingston is here, congressional correspondent for Puck News. Democratic strategist Joel Payne, he was a senior aide for Hillary for America and press secretary for former Senator Harry Reid. Former New York congressional candidate and journalist John Avlon, he hosts the Bulwark podcast, How to Fix It with John Avlon, which means it's a podcast that never, ever ends. And Paul Rieckhoff joins us, founder and CEO of Independent Veterans of America and co-founder of the American Veterans for Ukraine. Welcome to you all. But Paul, I have a really basic question. This idea that Pete Hegseth is potentially going to get rid of some top generals. Can you just fire generals? Is that how it works? Like, in my mind, I feel like they're there forever.
He can, unfortunately. And we've long been wondering how long it'll take before he gets rid of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, C.Q. Brown, who is in a really important place to be in the same spot that General Milley was in, to be a guardrail against Hegseth, Trump, and their extreme agenda. But I think what the last couple of days and 24 hours has really brought to bear is that the Pentagon is the focal point. It is the tip of the spear for everything that Trump wants to do, and the tip of the spear for his culture war. That's why he nominated a highly effective culture warrior like Pete Hegseth. That's why their priorities have been attacking DEI, banning trans people, banning the press, banning books in Department of Defense schools. Everything that they want to do in America, they're going to start with at the Pentagon. And that's, of course, the most dangerous place of all, because we've got nukes, we've got alliances, and we've got global conflict around the world. So this should be the focal point for all Americans, because it's the focal point for Trump right now.
The thing is, defense has always been a huge part of the federal budget, and Republicans have usually been okay with that. What do you think DOGE is specifically looking for when it comes to budget cuts? Because that's different from culture war.
Well, it might not be. They're probably going to look for anybody who has any kind of association with DEI or diversity. They could be looking for folks like veterans who have been recently hired and are under probationary status, because every time they do a cut, one thing I want to emphasize is 30% of all federal workers are veterans. So the problem here at the Pentagon is that DOGE hasn't exactly been a scalpel. They've been running ramshot across every agency in the federal government. At the VA, they just fired 1,000 people, including about a dozen people who work at the Veterans Crisis Line. So if they take that kind of approach to the Pentagon, this is literally the most dangerous scenario we could have, where they fire people indiscriminately, they fire people in vital roles that are touching national security, and they themselves are unvetted. We don't know where their alliances are, we don't know who they've colluded with, and it's not out of the realm of possibility to wonder, hey, maybe they have something to do with Russia, given the conversations that are happening from the president in the last 24 hours. So who are they? What are they doing? What's their mandate, and what kind of transparency will the American people have? Because this is literally as high as the stakes can possibly get.
Speaking of transparency, Elon Musk has always claimed to be this free speech warrior. Transparency is everything. But the claims he's making that DOGE has uncovered billions in waste and cuts to be made, where? What's the actual evidence?
Well, he's been wrong, and he's been off by major numbers. And this is, but the question is does this get back to American voters, given how convoluted the media ecosystem is? But this is just, I just want to underscore, I don't hear about Republicans cutting the Pentagon. I've covered Capitol Hill for a very long time, and there is never enough money for Republicans with the Pentagon budget. And this is just truly a watershed moment in the Republican Party right now.
I mean, look. I know you're weighing in on that.
I mean, 2 years ago, when Biden put out a budget that had a 3% increase, Republicans slammed it said it was woefully inadequate. So this
Woefully
is
inadequate.
Woefully inadequate. That was a 3% increase, not a proposed 8% cut. And so this is just a complete reversal of the roles, and it's a test of sort of whether Republicans are going to abandon yet another longstanding principled position out of fealty to Donald Trump. There's plenty of room to focus on increased efficiency in government. The GAO did a report just a couple years ago saying there was $250 billion, $250 billion up. Start there. But what's really sinister isn't just, looking for savings in the Pentagon. As Paul said, this is about whether they start firing generals and whether they use loyalty litmus tests to do that. That becomes very dangerous and something very different than what we've seen in our democracy.
Yeah, I mean, Stephanie, look, this is all, as John kind of alluded to. I feel like it's a test of what Trump can get Republicans to do.